If your town voted to ban cannabis sales, you just became a target for the next 12 months. Not for buying it, for doing exactly what the state says is legal. And that contradiction is about to cost Virginians their jobs, their housing, and in some cases, their freedom. Welcome to Norfolk, Virginia Cannabis Hub, where we focus on Virginia-specific cannabis law, local governance, and regulatory clarity, so residents, business owners, and communities understand what the law actually says, not just what headlines suggest. Here's a situation that sounds simple. Your town council, or your county board votes to opt out of allowing retail cannabis sales. The headlines say cannabis banned. And if you're a resident or a business owner, you might think, well, that's it. It's settled. But that's where the real legal uncertainty begins. Because the outcome for you, whether you're a consumer, a hopeful business owner, or even a local official, doesn't end with that vote. The enforcement, the practical implications, and the long-term consequences are where the confusion truly starts. And by the end of this, you'll see how a single legal distinction can change everything. Now, most people believe that when a locality opts out, cannabis becomes illegal within its borders. That's a natural assumption. But Virginia law, it doesn't work that way. The opt-out is specific. It's surgical. And understanding what it doesn't cover is just as critical as knowing what it does. Today, we're going to walk through the 2026 legal framework for local opt-outs in Virginia. We'll look at the statute, the enforcement mechanisms, and, more importantly, the real-world gaps that create risk and confusion. This is strictly an educational overview of the law as it stands. We do not promote sales or consumption. So, let's set the context. Why does this local opt-out even exist? Virginia's path to legalization created a sort of political compromise. The state law that set up the framework for adult-use retail sales also gave cities and counties a powerful tool, the ability to say no to those retail stores within their jurisdiction. This wasn't about possession or personal use, state law still governs that. This was purely about the brick-and-mortar business of selling cannabis for adult use. The confusion stems from how these two layers of law, state and local, interact. People hear ban and think it applies to everything. But the law carves out a very specific activity. Here's the legal explanation. The authority comes from the Virginia Code, specifically the provisions enacted alongside the retail sales framework. It allows a locality to pass an ordinance prohibiting the operation of retail cannabis stores. The mechanism is straightforward on paper, a vote by the governing body or, in some cases, a voter referendum. Now, that sounds clear. But legally true can be operationally misleading. Because the statute defines what a retail cannabis store is. And it doesn't touch, for example, the existing medical cannabis dispensaries, which operate under a separate license. It also doesn't address delivery services originating from a licensed retailer in a neighboring town that has opted in. This is where most people stop learning, and where problems start. The law creates a boundary around a storefront, but the reality of commerce and enforcement, that boundary gets very blurry. And this is where enforcement changes the outcome. Who enforces this opt-out? It's not primarily the state. It falls to local zoning officials and law enforcement. A business cannot get a local business license to operate a retail store. If they try to open without one, they'd face zoning violations and cease and desist orders. But here's the secondary risk: enforcement is complaint-driven and discretionary. A locality with limited resources might prioritize other issues. Or, they might aggressively target any activity they perceive as retail sales. This creates a patchwork, not just of laws, but of enforcement intensity. You could have two towns with identical opt-out ordinances, but the experience on the ground for consumers and businesses could be completely different. And we haven't even gotten to the consequences of that yet. So, who does this actually affect? Let's break it down. For consumers over 21, your right to possess and consume cannabis in private under state law is unchanged. However, your access is directly impacted. You cannot walk into a store in your opt-out town to make a purchase. That's the intended effect. For retailers and entrepreneurs, this is a hard barrier to entry in that specific locality. Your business plan for a storefront there is over. But what about a delivery hub? That's a gray area we'll come back to. For local governments, opting out means foregoing local tax revenue from sales, but also avoiding the zoning and public safety complexities of hosting these businesses. It's a trade-off. And for the medical cannabis framework, it's important to note that medical dispensaries are not affected by this adult-use retail opt-out. Their licensing is separate. Why does all this matter? Beyond the immediate access issue, it matters for public safety, regulatory clarity, and long-term policy. If consumers in an opt-out town have to drive significant distances to purchase legally, that raises safety questions. It also creates a potential market for illegal delivery services that operate in a shadowy, unregulated space. The lack of clarity around delivery from opt-in towns creates legal risk for licensed businesses trying to serve those areas. And for long-term policy, this patchwork system creates a natural experiment. Will opt-out towns see increased illicit market activity? Will they eventually reconsider for the tax revenue? These are the questions that will shape Virginia's cannabis landscape for years. Now, this is where what you think you understand shifts. We've talked about the law and who it affects. But the real-world consequence turns on a single, unresolved question that most people don't even think to ask. It's not about the storefront ban itself. It's about the movement of legally purchased cannabis into the opt-out town. And this is where the enforcement logic gets complicated. Let's walk through a scenario to resolve the loop we opened at the start. Earlier I mentioned that the outcome doesn't end with the local vote. Let's take Ashley, a resident of a town that opted out in 2025. She's 25. She knows possession is legal at the state level. She hears a friend got cannabis delivered from a licensed store in a neighboring city that allows sales. Ashley places an order. The delivery driver, an employee of the licensed store, brings it to her home. Now, what happens? On one hand, the sale transaction occurred at the licensed store in the opt-in city. The driver is just transporting legally possessed property to an adult. On the other hand, a local prosecutor in the opt-out town could argue the act of delivery constitutes a sale or distribution within their borders, especially if the payment is finalized upon delivery. The statute is silent on this cross-jurisdictional delivery. So, the enforcement outcome depends entirely on local interpretation and discretion. A small legal distinction, where the sale is considered finalized, changes everything. In one interpretation, Ashley and the driver have done nothing wrong. In another, they could be facing serious penalties. This is the silent legal question you were likely forming: if I can't buy it here, can I have it brought to me? The answer is, we don't have a clear legal answer, only a spectrum of risk. So, here's what to watch next. This delivery question naturally leads to the next unresolved legal issue: how will Virginia's state regulators and courts define the jurisdictional limits of a retail license? Here's a question to think about: if the goal of local opt-out is to prevent the visible presence of retail stores, does that goal extend to preventing the invisible convenience of home delivery? And where should that line be drawn? I'd invite your respectful thoughts in the comments below. What aspects of Virginia's cannabis laws are most unclear to you? Let me know what videos you want next. The legal takeaway is this: a local opt-out ban on retail sales is precisely that, a ban on physical storefronts. It is not a blanket cannabis ban. But its ripple effects into possession, transport, and delivery create a zone of legal uncertainty that depends entirely on local enforcement priorities. Always seek professional legal advice for your specific situation. If you found this breakdown helpful, please like, subscribe, and comment.